So who do you think was involved, James? Did you see any evidence of a cover-up in what you uncovered? Okay, but when you say investigating the family, do you mean specifically the parents, or do you mean someone else in the family?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Welcome to this ongoing analysis of the fascinating JonBenet Ramsey case. In this analysis, we're going to look at the answers Kolar gives to these three really on-the-chin questions from the CNN reporter. Remember, this interview Kolar gave to CNN was essentially a reaction to the announcement of the unsigned indictments from 2013. What was a shock was that the grand jury voted to indict, and then at the same time, the district attorney didn't sign these indictments. This interview that Kolar gave was also, in a way, asking about, what did these indictments imply, which is not a conversation we see very often. I mean, do you see it's subtle? The indictments are explicit about something, but another thing that's implicit is not mentioned. It's subtle. Even when the reporter tries to unsubtle the situation, which he does several times, the interviewee, Kolar, is more than a little coy. Why do you think that is? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you're enjoying this channel, bear in mind there is a Patreon page where all the scripts for these videos are published, and there are almost 500 on the Ramsey case alone. There are also audiobooks on the $5 and $10 tiers. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now remember, James Kolar's book Foreign Faction came out just the previous year. If the news broke about these true bills, these indictments, well, just the previous year in 2012, Kolar's book came out, and a lot of information was suddenly released that people didn't know about. And one can't help wondering if the journalist who made the open records request that led to the shocking release of the true bills, the 4 indictments for Patsy and John in 2013, one's got to wonder, if he didn't do so to some extent on the basis of reading Foreign Faction and having his own interest pricked in this case. And that book really contains a lot of inside information on this case. If you haven't read Foreign Faction, I highly suggest you do so. The information in Foreign Faction that is particularly insightful has to do with the grand jury. I really found that really interesting. Now, what is also interesting to note in this 6.5-minute interview on CNN is firstly how tired and drained Kolar seems. Even his voice sounds worn out. I can tell you, writing a book can do that to you even months after the fact. Secondly, it's fascinating how the reporter repeatedly tries to draw Kolar out into saying explicitly and obviously who he thinks killed JonBenet. And then also how carefully Kolar chooses his words to construct his answers. And then also, thirdly, we see just how poor the comprehension is, certainly in certain areas of this case, of certain news reporters covering this case. Often they can't even get the basics right. Anyway, we will drill down into some of those specifics in the final minutes of this analysis. I do think what is also really interesting in this interview is Kolar expressing his opinion on what he thinks needs to happen to make this case move forward. And you know what? It would be a bold move, but will it ever happen? He also makes a suggestion in the final minutes of the interview. I'm going to be dealing with that in the final minutes of this video, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, now let's look at 6 insights from Kolar's 2013 CNN interview. Number 1, secret file. Kolar also lets on that there is a secret file in the Ramsey case, a file I think he has seen, and the chances of it being released to the public someday, he sort of talks about that. And here I think he's referring to the grand jury file dealing with the grand jury investigation. So although it sounds, secret file sounds quite intriguing, I think it's kind of obvious what that is. Now remember, all we really know about the secret file, meaning the grand jury investigation, is the end result, the true bills. We basically know the finishing line of that whole process. And we also know that this was kept secret, these true bills, the finishing line was kept secret for 13 years. And so here's a question. How many years will the grand jury investigation files be kept secret as well? Indefinitely? Isn't it in the public interest to release them, given the interest in the recent Netflix series, given the overall interest in this case? Or, and I think it's a fair question to ask, and a fair question to think about, is it somehow in the public interest not to release the grand jury investigation? And if it is in the public interest not to do that, why could that be, right, if it is so? I mean, was Alex Hunter ultimately right to shut down this case? Number 2, waiting game brought to you by the Ramsey ransom note and the DNA narrative.
Count 7 from this grand jury basically said that they knew who killed her but covered it up. They looked at, I know this grand jury looked at 30,000 pieces of evidence, dozens of witnesses over 13 months. Did you see any evidence of a cover-up in what you uncovered?
I think it's extremely unlikely that an intruder was involved in this situation. And what's frustrating for me is that the DNA evidence continues to be proffered as proof that an intruder was involved.
If you think about it, the ransom note, bogus or not, legitimate or not, authentic or not, did the work of obscuring and delaying the discovery of JonBenet's body, not only where she was, but what had happened to her, for crucial hours. Hours and hours during the so-called kidnapping phase. The ransom note, as I say, true or false, real or staged, did the job brilliantly of causing everyone to go into a sort of wait-and-see mode. I've always found it kind of funny, although it's not really funny, the way Patsy's like, hurry, 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 and then everyone must come to the house and sit around and wait for a phone call that's not going to take place, for a kidnapper that's not going to call, for a ransom that's not going to be collected. Hurry, 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 and wait for nothing to take place. And instead of searching for JonBenet, instead of properly questioning the parents, well, let's wait for the phantom kidnapper to call. And of course, he never did. And that also opened a window during which the crime scene was massively contaminated. While everyone's waiting, let's contaminate the crime scene. Let's offer suggestions for who could have done this. Let's kind of confuse the whole case and interfere with it, and not least JonBenet's body as well. Today, where we are right now, we are in an intruder phase where everyone has agreed to wait and see what the DNA results of one iffy, dubious mixed sample might bring about. While that is happening, the case is in limbo, with no one asking questions and no one talking about all the other difficult areas. One of them is JonBenet's medical history. Why don't we try and resolve that in the meantime? And you'll notice, as a result of this focus on, this laser focus on the DNA, we're told to focus on the DNA. We're told it's a DNA case. We're told DNA will be the breakthrough. There's no interest, no awareness, no knowledge, no investigation whatsoever into other areas, such as the dark, cloudy, and stinky poop narrative. In this way, even today, the Ramsey narrative is being controlled. All the news you ever hear is either about DNA or it's some breakthrough about a possible pedophile suspect that ends up being actually resuscitated from the distant past and then becoming a dead end again. It was a dead end then, it's a dead end now, and it'll be a dead end later on when it happens again. Because, of course, none of these pedophile prime suspects match the DNA that was taken from the scene. That brings us to number 3, Kolar's caginess. Why is it necessary? Is it necessary?
So who do you think was involved, James?
I do not think an intruder was involved.
So do you think the parents are incriminated in this case based on all the evidence you've seen?
I believe a strong look was warranted by investigating the family as a possible...
Okay, but when you say investigating the family, do you mean specifically the parents or do you mean someone else in the family?
There were 3 people in the home that evening. I think investigators needed to look at all 3 of them.
I think those questions and answers speak for themselves, don't they? But there's a little bit of subtlety in there. Now, that brings us to number 4, Kolar's astonishing suggestion. When the reporter asks Kolar if he thinks this case will ever be solved, he says no. But then he volunteers a suggestion. It's quite interesting.
And that was another grand jury inquiry and calling Burke Ramsey to the stand in that event. Would anything come of that? I couldn't say for certain. But he turned efforts away from investigators to interview him back in 2009, and a grand jury might be another opportunity to see if they could get that interview.
Wait a second. Kolar seems to think JonBenet's brother is an important witness.
I fear you might be right.
And that brings us to number 5, and Burke is question mark. It's really quite astonishing how the interviewer here seems to be wrong-footed by Kolar bringing up Burke Ramsey. It's almost like she's never heard of him.
Okay, and again, who is it that you would like to hear them interview?
Burke Ramsey.
And Burke is?
Burke is the son who was in the home at the time of the homicide.
The 13-year-old. Did you interview?
The 13-year-old. Huh. Well, you know what this shows is just how successfully Burke has been effectively excised out of the whole story, the investigation, the evidence, even the true bills. And that brings us to the 6th and final point. In 2009, a cold case task force attempted to interview Burke Ramsey. That seems to be almost the last leg of the whole Ramsey investigation. And of course, there's not really a leg to stand on because nothing really happened. Because Burke didn't want to be interviewed. And he didn't want to be interviewed for the Netflix series 16 years later, basically this year, basically November 2024. In hindsight, do you think Kolar was right to be cautious regarding the interviewer's questions? I mean, consider the alternative. The true bills had just been made public. The unsigned indictments proved what the grand jury decided. And despite years of misleading press coverage based around the way the message around the indictments had kind of been manipulated, now the truth was out. Now the truth had been laid bare. And so given that, couldn't Kolar confidently share his theory? Well, think about it. Because the indictments were unsigned by the district attorney, they effectively don't have that much legal weight behind them. 3 years later, Kolar participated in the CBS docu-series that was in 2016 on the 20th anniversary, where I think he was less constrained in sharing his views. And guess what happened? CBS, as well as everyone in that docu-series, was slapped with a massive $750 million lawsuit. And who was their accuser? Burke Ramsey. So Kolar's idea for a grand jury compelling Burke Ramsey to testify, it's kind of a neat idea, but it's never going to happen. Does that make sense? I'm not going to take it further than that. In our next analysis, we'll look at Dr. Mayer's theory, the coroner. Also, I'm doing a side-by-side series to this one on the Gabby Petito case. If you haven't already watched one of the episodes, make sure you do. This promises to be quite compelling as well. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.